Hi, Tom from Hawfish here, and in this video I want to talk a little bit about rods and reels combos and what a beginner or a kid should look for when selecting their combo. Stay tuned. Okay, we're back, and let's talk about the three main types of rods and reels combinations that you're going to see in the stores. One will be what they call Baitcaster, and we're going to eliminate this right from the start for beginners. This has many advantages for an advanced angler. It's what we use when we're fishing tournaments. However, it requires a lot more coordination with your hands and your thumb to operate it. So we're going to wipe these out right from the start. The two types that I want you to focus on are spin casting, which has the push button that a lot of people are familiar with, and a spinning outfit. One of these two will work great for a beginner. Depending on your skill level and your coordination you have in your hands, I'd probably lean towards starting with this because it's the type that you can continue to use from now until you stop fishing. However, if it's a young child, sometimes this can be a little bit more easy to operate. Okay, when selecting the rod, if you didn't pick a combo that came with a rod and reel altogether, you'll be selecting a rod individually, separate from the reel, which is okay too. In some cases, that may be what you want to do. But for rods for a beginner, especially with kids, go with a 4 to 5 foot max length in the rod. Most of the rods that you'll find are some sort of graphite or graphite blend, and that's fine. You don't need to worry about that. It shouldn't be overly heavy. Pick something light, especially for a kid. And I don't want you to go over about 5 foot. The length of rod, the longer the rod is, the more leverage you have for farther casts. However, keep in mind when you're down at the pond or the lake, you'll be traveling through the woods and between trees and bushes and so forth. So you don't want to have too long of a rod for a youngster to be banging off of trees and trying to navigate through the bushes. So start with a rod that's about 4 to 5 foot and get the reel to fit the hand good, and you should be good to go. Okay, I wanted to make a note. When selecting your rod, you want one of the most important things to consider is that it fits in your hand. So if you're talking about getting a rod, thinking about getting a rod for a young kid, if they're 4 or 5 years old, their hands are so small that a lot of the rods won't fit them properly. So if a kid is trying to, if they're fighting the rod and they can't squeeze the trigger or they can't fit the line in their finger, they can't operate the rod, they're going to lose interest in fishing. So it's very important to get them something that they're comfortable with. Even if you take them to the store shopping and have them hold a few, it can tell you a lot about whether that rod is right for them. When selecting your rod, I want you to watch out for a few things. A lot of times you'll see kits like this where they'll come with a tackle box. They already have the line spooled on. It's a 2-piece rod. It fits in your car easy. Even though these seem easy because everything's put in one package, if you're buying something for a kid, look at the size of the reel that a lot of these come with. This is much too large for a kid to be able to use. Even some of the reels that I use, fishing tournaments aren't this big. But be aware of what you're getting. That's why I want to stress so important to get one to fit their hands that they're able to use. You can see the difference. This is my daughter's. rod. She's 6 years old now. She's been using this since she was about 4 years old. But you can see the difference. In this case, how you use this rod is you need to pinch the line, which means your hand's on the rod, and you need to be able to hold that line up against the rod. Well, the distance that's between the rod and this spool where you hold the line is much greater on this one than it is this one. So if I gave this rod to her to use for the first time, she'll have to stretch so far with her hands just to be able to operate it that it's not fun anymore. And that's what you don't want. Other types of rods you'll find are a lot of rod companies are leaning towards the girls, and that is fantastic. My daughter saw this rod and fell in love with it. This is when she was about 5-6 years old because it's pink. It's fantastic, and it has lights. I'm all for giving kids incentives on flashy things like this to get them to start fishing, whatever it takes. That's a good thing. The downside is her hands are too small, and the same deal that I talked about with this big setup, she couldn't work it right. So I realized right quick that we're going to need to find you one that fits her better. You'll see a lot of these where they'll have different cartoons and stuff like that on there. If your kid's very young, never picked up a rod before, these can be okay. Be wary, the same deal, make sure they fit. If you look at this rod, I think I picked this rod up, I've had it a long time, but I believe I bought the reel separate from the rod, which is an option for you to do. This reel, because it's a little bit smaller than this one, actually fit in my daughter's hands better. And the other thing that it had going for it was a little bit longer. I think this is a 4.5 foot rod. A little bit longer rod will give you more leverage and help you on hook sets when you're fishing. And we'll get into the mechanics at the lake, casting and how you set your hook and so forth in another video. But the ideal rod would be something nice and small and about 4.5 foot long. These are great in that they attract kids to fishing, which is a good thing, but a lot of times they don't make for a very good rod. They're too short to set the hook, and a lot of times the size of the reel that they're putting on them is much too large for the hands. So just keep that in mind. But if it's a deal breaker to get your kid fishing, by all means try it. They don't cost a lot. You can go with that. Okay, here's a closer view of the two types of rods that beginners should pick from. Your spinning outfit, as I mentioned before, and here's your spin casting. Let's take a look at the parts so you're familiar with how to operate them. Let's look at the spin casting or push button reel. They've had several names. I think the technical term is a spin casting. But you have your handle crank, and it only moves in one direction. It won't go backwards, it will only go forward. You have the push button here, and that's how you operate it. A lot of these rods will have a trigger to help you grip. Basically, to operate this, you push the button, and if you hold this in, it holds your line. It holds your line in. As soon as you let that button go, line can start to come out. And that's, in its simplest form, that's how you'll end up casting. But let's take a look at a couple other features that they have. This is your drag setting. Sometimes in the graphics they'll show a minus or a plus telling you which direction is more drag or less drag. And all that means is if I want less drag, what that does to the reel is allow it to be much easier for that fish to pull line off of the spool. If it's set too loose, you could be reeling and reeling, and if you hear that sound, that means that he's pulling the line off of the spool. And if it's set too loose, as you crank, so long as you're hearing that sort of ratcheted sound, you're not gaining any line back. So you want to make sure that that's set enough that as you wind the handle, you're bringing the fish in. So if it's too loose, you can just slide this towards the plus, and it'll increase the tension on how hard a fish needs to pull that line. Now, because your line is set at a certain rating, you want to be careful that you don't have it too high. Find some place in the middle, and you'll know when you catch a fish whether it's too loose or too tight. Too tight, and you get a big fish. Now everything is putting the pressure on the line, and you're not using your reel to your advantage, which means the line could break. If it's set too loose, like I said before, they'll take too much out. So you want to play with it a little bit, find some in between. When you're going for panfish and small fish, it's not necessary to have it up too high. You can have it fairly loose. Another thing I'd like to point out is if you or your kid is left-handed or right-handed, they'll have a dominant way where they like to cast the rod. If they're right-handed, typically they hold the rod in their right hand. But what I want you to know is on most reels, this one included and also with the spinning, which I'll show in a moment, this handle can be adjusted. So by adjusted, I mean, in this case, you see there's this big screw here. And don't be afraid with a screwdriver. If you take this screw out, what that does is that this screw goes directly over to the handle. So, and a lot of times these are big enough you can even use a dime or a quarter in case you're out at the lake. But don't be afraid of this. You can easily put this onto the other side and then put your screw back in and tighten it down. Almost all reels will do this. A lot of people don't realize that, but for some reason I know my daughter has changed which side she likes it on. I'm not sure if they're both my daughters are right-handed, but you just have to feel what's most comfortable for you or your kids. But you can see how fast I changed that over, and now it's on the other side. Okay, let's look for look at the spinning reel and its parts. You have the thing that sticks out the most, obviously, is your spool that's kind of with your line exposed. You have this wire, which is called a bail. Same deal. You have a handle, and in this case, the drag is right here. It's on the top. If you turn this to the right or to the left, it will increase whether that spool can turn on its own. And typical rule, if you know the righty-tighty, lefty-loosey phrase, if you turn it to the right, that tightens it. That'll make it tighter. If you turn it to the left, that'll make it looser. You'll notice on most spinning reels they have a little lever underneath here. For the most part, you want to keep this on. This is an anti-reverse setting, which kind of opens the gears up in there, meaning I can't make this go backwards. But if I flip that, that'll allow me to do that. Some guys, I know even in the Great Lakes when they're fighting giant fish, they like to be able to back turn their spool as opposed to use their drag. But as a beginner, don't even worry about it. Make sure that that's on. I just wanted to mention that it's there in case it gets bumped and you're wondering why your reel is going both directions. That's the reason why. And these reels, to cast these, as you hold the rod in your hand, what you want to do is you'll see that there's a bearing here where the line comes out over top of the bail and heads up to the tip of the rod. You want to pinch this line in your finger like that, and then you open your bail. And what that allows it to do now is this line will fly as soon as you let that go. So as I let this go with my finger, line starts to come off of the spool. Once you have casted and your bobber or your bait or lure has landed in the water, you want to close this bail. Now, these are called, something to remember, these are called spinning reels for a reason. They spin around this spool, and what that causes is line twist. I see a big mistake I see a lot of people doing is when they after they've casted, they want to do this to close their bail. Try and, since you're just starting out, a really good habit to get into is close the bail manually. In other words, with your hand. Don't crank the handle to close your bail. When you crank the handle to close your bail, that can cause twists in your line, and you'll get a loop here, which can cause problems when you're casting. So once you cast your rod, close it by hand, and then start reeling. Another thing I wanted to show you is, as with the spin casting or the push button reel, the handles can be adjusted, and this is no different. On the opposite side of the handle, in this case it has a thumb screw that if this is loosened up, this thumb screw will come out, and what that's doing is loosening up your handle. You can see on this side, as I loosen that, the handle starting to come out of the reel. You won't damage anything, and quite frankly, you're probably only going to do this one time until you get used to which side you want it on. But you can take this and put it into the other side and put the thumb screw on the other side, and now you'll have a reel with a handle that's on the side that you're most comfortable with. Now it's the other way. So in closing, with as far as the rods, I gave you a lot of information, but hopefully you have an understanding on how all the parts to the rod, rod and reel I should say, and how they work, and be able to go into a store and pick out a rod that will work good for the angler that's interested in fishing.